He called him just a janitor. But when the emergency hit, the janitor stepped up and saved a plane. Now the whole airport knows who the real hero is. If you've ever felt overlooked, if someone once doubted your worth because of your job, your age, or where you came from, this story is for you. It's about dignity, second chances, and how a quiet soul can surprise the world. Don't forget to leave a comment, subscribe, and share your own airport stories below. And if this story touches you, a super thanks helps support more videos just like this one. Now let's begin. The airport was unusually quiet that morning. A soft fog rolled across the tarmac like a whispered secret, and the intercom buzzed faintly with boarding calls. In Gate 17's waiting area, the leather seats gleamed under the fluorescent lights, recently wiped down by the janitor whose name nobody seemed to know. Rick Thornton stood near the terminal windows, boots polished, hat tilted just so. At 68, Rick was a retired senior pilot who still wore his old uniform when traveling, a badge of honor he refused to put away. To the airport regulars, he was a symbol of the golden days of aviation, a man who'd flown through storms and war zones, shaking hands with presidents and patching engines mid-air with nothing but duct tape and grit, or so he claimed. He sipped black coffee from a silver thermos, watching the janitor mop the floor with steady, careful strokes. A young man, maybe mid-20s, with dark skin and calm eyes. His name tag read, Elijah. His back was straight, and there was something quiet in the way he moved, almost reverent, like the floor beneath his mop was sacred ground. Rick squinted. "Funny, isn't it?" he said out loud, not caring who heard. "Back in my day, we aimed for the skies. Now kids just aim for minimum wage." Elijah paused mid-swipe but didn't look up. Rick chuckled to himself and shook his head. Not that there's anything wrong with a little elbow grease. Just, some folks don't aim high enough is all. Elijah didn't reply. Instead, he adjusted his gloves and continued his work, but something in his silence made a few nearby passengers glance up from their phones. Rick took another sip of coffee and leaned back on his heels. "You know," he added a little louder, "I used to fly a 747 over the Atlantic. Nights so black you couldn't tell where the sky ended and the ocean began. Took more than a mop to get through those hours." Still no response. Elijah finished cleaning around the chairs and wheeled his bucket to the side. As he walked past, Rick offered a parting shot. "Don't take it personally, son. Someone's got to clean up after the real work gets done." This time, Elijah stopped. He turned slowly, not angrily, not with fire, but with something deeper, steadier. "I'm just doing my part, sir," he said. His voice was low, respectful, but firm. "Same as anyone else here." Rick raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir." Elijah nodded, his expression unreadable. "You flew the skies, that's honorable. But this place runs because someone keeps it clean, safe, ready for people like you to land." For a second, Rick didn't answer. Something in the kid's tone, not sarcasm, not defiance, just truth, plain and unshakable, made him hesitate. But pride was an old friend. Rick scoffed and turned back toward the window. "Whatever helps you sleep at night." Elijah didn't reply. He pushed his cart toward the next gate, leaving behind only silence and the faint scent of lemon cleaner. Passengers shifted in their seats. A woman with silver hair shook her head slightly. A man in a business suit tapped his phone harder than necessary. Rick didn't notice, or maybe he pretended not to, but something in his chest, a whisper of guilt maybe, lingered like jet fuel in the air. The corridor between Gate 17 and the janitor's closet was narrow, with beige walls and scuff marks from decades of luggage wheels. Elijah moved through it like he'd done 100 times before, because he had. Every inch of that airport was known to him, not just as a job site, but almost like an old, stubborn friend. He didn't need maps. He knew where the floor creaked, where the vending machines swallowed quarters, and where the sunlight hit just right through the skylight on winter mornings. He parked his cart and leaned on the mop handle for a breath. The air back here smelled like rubber soles and Lysol. It was quiet, blessedly quiet, but Rick's voice still echoed in his mind. Some folks don't aim high enough. Elijah didn't let it sting. Not the way it might have 5 years ago. He'd built walls since then, not the kind you could see, the kind you needed to survive when the world didn't see you, or when it only saw the dirt beneath your shoes. He sat on the small bench inside the supply room, the only space in the entire airport that was his alone. A photo was taped above the sink. An old, worn picture of a young boy sitting on a mechanic's lap, both of them laughing beside a tiny model airplane. His father. Darrell Nash had been an aircraft mechanic at this very airport. Elijah used to visit him every other weekend, sitting in the hangars, watching him work, asking endless questions about landing gear and fuel gauges. Back then, Elijah didn't dream of being a janitor. He wanted to be a pilot, not because it was flashy, but because he thought it was the closest thing to freedom. The clouds, the sky, the silence above the world's noise. It called to something deep in him. But dreams can take hits, hard ones. When Elijah was 17, his father died in a freak maintenance accident. A hydraulic valve gave way. Instant. No warning. 1 second he was there, the next, gone. The grief was thick, numbing. But what came after? Bills, eviction, a mother broken in half. That's what changed everything. Elijah dropped out of school for a time, worked 2 jobs, tried to keep food on the table. He never reapplied to flight school. It was a door he closed quietly, without ceremony. Still, he'd found his way back here, not in the way he imagined, no. But cleaning the very gates his father used to service made him feel close to something. It felt like a circle that wasn't broken, just rerouted. Out in the terminal, the intercom pinged again. Elijah rose, tightened his gloves, and returned to the marble floors. He passed gate 19, where an elderly woman struggled to lift her suitcase into the overhead compartment. No attendants in sight. Elijah paused, set his mop aside, and stepped in. "May I help you with that, ma'am?" She blinked up at him. "Would you?" "Oh, thank you. It's heavier than it looks." With a swift, practiced motion, Elijah lifted the bag and secured it in place. She smiled, clearly relieved. "You've got strong arms," she said warmly. "You a football player?" Elijah chuckled. "No, ma'am. Just carry a lot of buckets." She laughed and patted his shoulder. "Well, if you ever get tired of cleaning floors, I bet you could fix planes too. Something in your eyes says you know your way around more than a mop." Elijah smiled politely, but inside, the words struck something tender. As he turned back toward his cart, he saw Rick again, the old pilot now seated alone, flipping through a flight magazine like it held memories instead of ads. Rick didn't glance up. Elijah moved on, because some moments don't need confrontation. Some moments need only quiet dignity, the kind that doesn't raise its voice but refuses to be made small. And Elijah Nash was far from small. Rick Thornton sat rigid in the faux leather airport chair, arms crossed over his chest like a man guarding a legacy. The magazine in his hands hadn't been read. Not really. He'd flipped the pages out of habit, not interest. His mind was still on the janitor. That kid had nerve, speaking back like that. Polite, sure, but still. It rankled him. In Rick's world, hierarchy mattered. Respect was earned, yes, but it was also expected. Especially when you had 4 decades of flight hours under your belt and enough commendations to fill a shadow box. He glanced at the watch on his wrist. A gift from the airline when he retired. Gold-plated, with an inscription that read, "To Captain Rick Thornton, for flying through storms so others could see the sun." He still wore it every day. Nearby, two flight attendants passed by, chatting in hushed tones. One of them nodded politely. Rick gave a tight smile in return. They didn't know him. Nobody did anymore. Most of the younger staff had no idea he once saved a transatlantic flight by rerouting through Greenland during a systems failure. These days he was just the old guy in the pilot hat. Still, pride was a powerful thing. He adjusted his collar and sat up straighter. He remembered a time when men like him were treated like legends, when kids would beg to see the cockpit and passengers applauded after a smooth landing. When flying was an art, not a checklist. And then it all changed. Budget airlines, autopilot systems, younger pilots with shiny resumes and too many opinions, and people like that janitor, walking around as if they belonged in the same conversation. Rick frowned. He didn't dislike the kid, not exactly, but there was something about him too calm, too sure of himself for someone pushing a mop. It rubbed Rick the wrong way. It reminded him of a second lieutenant he once trained, smart, steady, soft-spoken, who ended up outshining Rick during a review and was promoted over him. The humiliation never fully left. Rick shook the thought away. Across from him, a child with blonde curls dropped a juice box. The mother apologized, grabbing tissues from her purse. Rick watched silently as Elijah, like clockwork, appeared from a corner, crouched down, and cleaned the mess without a word. The boy grinned up at him. Elijah winked. "Thanks, young man," the mother said. "You're very kind." Rick rolled his eyes and muttered under his breath, "They don't give out medals for wiping apple juice." A man beside him, early 50s, grey at the temples, turned slightly. "Excuse me," he asked. Rick blinked. He hadn't meant to be overheard. "Nothing," he muttered. The man tilted his head. "You were a pilot, weren't you? I recognize the insignia." Rick straightened. "Senior captain, 42 years. No accidents. No delays?" The man's eyes widened slightly. "Impressive. You must have stories." Rick allowed himself a half smile. "Plenty. Most folks today wouldn't believe half of them." The man chuckled. "Well, don't let them slip away. You ought to write them down." "There's honor in what you did." Rick nodded. He liked that. Honor. Finally, someone who understood. But even as the compliment warmed him, his eyes flicked back to Elijah, now helping an elderly couple lift their carry-on bags. And for a moment, just a flicker, Rick felt something twist in his gut, because the people who should be noticing him were clapping for someone else. A janitor. He took another sip from his thermos. The coffee had gone cold. The boarding area buzzed with the usual symphony of movement, rolling luggage, boarding calls, and the quiet shuffle of anticipation. Gate 21 was full, and the tension in the air wasn't just about delayed flights. Elijah moved through the crowd with a practiced rhythm, collecting a spill here, straightening a rug there. His focus never wavered, even as he passed Rick for the third time that morning. He could feel the old pilot's eyes on his back, heavy, judgmental, simmering. Rick, arms folded again, sat with a look of growing irritation. It wasn't just the mop. It was the way Elijah carried himself. Calm, self-assured, like a man who didn't know his place. To Rick, that was the problem. And it came to a head at precisely 11:06 a.m. A woman in a red sweater spilled her latte near the gate entrance. It soaked into the carpet, dark and steaming. Elijah was on it in seconds, blotting and spraying with professional efficiency. Rick, sitting nearby, muttered loudly, "Maybe if you mopped faster, she wouldn't have slipped." Elijah glanced up, not angrily, just surprised. The woman, now embarrassed, tried to help. "It was my fault." But Rick raised his voice, his tone sharp. "Back in my day, mistakes got you reprimanded. Now we just hand out compliments for wiping up messes." Passengers looked up. A toddler nearby stopped mid-sip from his juice box. Elijah stood slowly, sponge still in hand. His eyes met Rick's, level, calm. "With respect, sir." Elijah said evenly. "I didn't cause the spill. I'm just cleaning it." Rick scoffed, standing too, drawing a few steps closer. "You know what bothers me, son? You walk around this place like you own it. Like you're too good for that mop," whispers stirred among the travelers. "I take pride in my work," Elijah replied, voice steady. "No jobs beneath me. Maybe that's what bothers you." A murmur rippled through the crowd. A teenager pulled out her phone, not discreetly. People were watching now, a full audience. Rick's face turned red. "You think pride comes from pushing a bucket?" he snapped. "Let me tell you something. I flew rescue missions in '88. I've landed planes with one engine. I've had captains salute me. You think your little mop makes you important?" Elijah didn't flinch. "No, sir," he said softly. "But I think how you treat people does." Silence. Someone gasped. The woman in red whispered, "Good for him." Rick looked around, suddenly aware that the room had shifted. Eyes weren't admiring his badge. They were watching Elijah respectfully, defensively. He opened his mouth, then shut it. His jaw tightened. Elijah bent down again, finishing the spill without another word. His movements were gentle, purposeful. Rick turned back toward his seat, now exposed in a way he hadn't felt in years. In the distance, a child clapped, just once, before being hushed by his mother. Elijah didn't acknowledge it. He didn't need to, because sometimes the quietest dignity is the loudest reply. Long after the confrontation at Gate 21, Elijah stood in the janitor's locker room, a narrow, windowless space tucked behind the baggage office. The walls were lined with old grey lockers, dented and streaked with age. A small fan hummed in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the heavy air. Elijah pulled off his gloves and washed his hands slowly. The water was warm, almost comforting. But the sting in his chest from Rick's words hadn't faded. He looked at himself in the mirror. 27 years old, neatly trimmed beard, eyes that had seen too much for someone so young, his name badge still pinned to his shirt, a symbol of work, of routine, of humility. He didn't hate the job. He just hadn't expected to still be here. He reached into his locker and pulled out a folded envelope. Inside was a worn acceptance letter, the ink faded but still legible. "Congratulations, Mr. Elijah Nash. You have been accepted into the Atlanta School of Aviation, class of 2018. He ran his fingers over the paper like it was a relic from a life that never quite took flight. He had been 18 when the letter arrived. First in his class to get in, his instructors had called him the quiet genius. He'd scored top marks on every mock flight simulator. His dream of becoming a pilot felt close enough to touch. But then came the call. His mother, sobbing. The accident. His father, gone. The man who taught him everything about airplanes, about discipline, about pride. Darryl Nash had worked maintenance at the very same airport where Elijah now mopped floors. He'd died beneath a fuselage, crushed by a failed support beam. There was no lawsuit, no insurance payout, just silence and bills. Lots of bills. Elijah deferred school. Just for a semester, he told himself. Then he took a job at the airport. Part-time, then full-time. He paid rent. Took care of his mother. Time passed. 5 years later, he was still here, still mopping, still dreaming when nobody was watching. He never reapplied. Not because he'd failed, but because life had other plans. Plans that demanded sacrifice. But Elijah never complained. He believed in doing what needed to be done. Quietly, with dignity. Still, there were nights when he sat on the airport's rooftop, watching the planes disappear into the clouds, wondering where he might be if things had gone differently. A sharp knock on the locker room door startled him. "Break's over, Nash," came a voice. It was Jody, the supervisor. "Gate 24's a mess. Coffee again." He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his wallet behind his ID. "On it," he said. As he walked back into the main corridor, He passed a wall of framed photographs, pilots and crews from decades past. There, near the end, was a photo he always paused by. His father, grinning beside a gleaming Boeing, sleeves rolled, arms strong, grease smudged on his cheek. Elijah touched the frame lightly. "I'm still here, Dad," he whispered, "still flying in my own way." Out in the terminal, the world moved on. Passengers, announcements, 100 journeys beginning and ending. Elijah stepped into it like a current, his shoulders squared. He wasn't just a janitor, he was a man who had traded one kind of uniform for another and worn both with honor. The storm rolled in faster than anyone expected. Thick clouds swallowed the sun, casting the airport in an eerie gray. The rain hit the windows like static, and wind gusts shook the terminal glass just enough to rattle nerves. Gate 25's flight was delayed. Gate 26 had rerouted. People were restless. Some were scared. And then, at Gate 28, came the sound nobody wanted to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation." The intercom voice was strained, unsure. A small private aircraft inbound for maintenance had lost hydraulic pressure. It wasn't a passenger flight, but it was real and it was serious. Elijah was near Gate 30 when he heard it. His body froze for a second, not in fear, but in recognition. He knew that tone, that kind of emergency. His father had once described it in perfect detail. The signs, the sounds, the sinking feeling in your gut when you lost control in a descent. As the crowd murmured and clustered near the windows, Elijah walked toward the commotion. Not to gawk, not to panic, but to listen. A junior gate agent, barely in her 20s, fumbled at the desk. We need clearance for emergency responders, and someone needs to, I don't know, advise on protocols." No one moved. Rick Thornton stood nearby, arms crossed, lips tight. His eyes scanned the runway through the mist. He could see the plane, a Cessna, listing slightly, coming in hot. But he didn't step forward. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the years since his last flight. Maybe it was fear. Then Elijah stepped to the desk. "Give me the comm," he said gently. The young agent blinked. "I know what I'm doing," he said, his voice calm. "Please." She handed it over. Elijah pressed the button and spoke into the tower frequency like it was second nature. "Tower, this is terminal response at Gate 28. I need condition status on the inbound Cessna 410. Confirm hydraulic systems failure and wind shear index." Silence, then static, then confirmed. Pilot requesting guidance. No senior response on file. Rick's head snapped around. The kid knew the codes. Elijah's voice was steady. "Tell the pilot to come in with flaps at 30. Winds shifting west-northwest. If nose gear's compromised, request foam deployment on strip 3. People gathered. Even flight crews stopped moving. Rick took a step forward. "How do you know that protocol?" Elijah glanced at him briefly. "I studied flight systems," he said, "long before I picked up a mop." From the tower. "Inbound Cessna acknowledges. Executing final turn." Moments later, the aircraft touched down, rough, angled and fast. Sparks flew as the front gear collapsed. But the foam did its job. The plane skidded, slowed and stopped. Emergency crews moved in. Applause broke out in the terminal, not wild, but real. And everyone looked at Elijah. Rick didn't clap, not yet. But his face, something in it, cracked. Elijah returned the comm device to the desk, nodded once and turned away. He didn't wait for praise. He didn't need it. Because for the first time in a long time, someone had seen who he really was. 3 days had passed since the Cessna landing. The weather had cleared, but the buzz inside the airport had not. The story had spread like wildfire. Not on national news, of course, it was too small for that, but on social media, in group chats among employees. People were talking, Whispers of that janitor who helped land a plane. Some thought it was a rumor, others had seen it with their own eyes. Elijah, meanwhile, kept working. He mopped the same floors, clocked in at the same time, took his breaks in the same dim locker room. When asked about it, he simply shrugged and said, "Just did what I could." But fate had its own plans. On Saturday morning, just after the 9:30 rush, the intercom crackled across the terminal. "Attention, all staff and travelers in Concourse C. Please direct your attention to Gate 22 for a special announcement." Elijah, mop in hand, blinked. He hadn't heard about any event. He headed toward Gate 22 out of curiosity. A small podium had been set up near the windows, flanked by 2 flags and a banner that read, "Service Beyond Duty." Airport staff gathered, as did passengers. Rick stood off to the side, arms behind his back. He had come early that day, something gnawing at him since the incident. He didn't know why he was there, or maybe he did. A woman in a blazer stepped to the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to recognize an act of quiet heroism. Last week, during an unexpected aircraft emergency, one of our own stepped up, not because it was his job, but because he had the knowledge, the courage, and the heart to do so." She paused, scanning the crowd. "Elijah Nash, would you please come forward?" There was a beat of silence, then heads turned as Elijah, stunned, lowered his mop and slowly walked forward. People clapped, softly at first, then louder. Rick stared. "He calmly took control of radio communication," the speaker continued, "advised on aviation protocol and guided a struggling pilot to a safe landing, averting what could have been a tragic incident. Most of us didn't even know he had aviation training. But heroes don't always wear uniforms with wings. Sometimes they wear gloves and carry a mop." Applause erupted. Elijah stood there, unsure what to do with his hands. The speaker handed him a plaque. His name was engraved on it. His real name, his full name, not just Elijah Janitorial Staff. Behind him someone whistled, others took out their phones. Then came something Elijah didn't expect, a voice from the back. "Excuse me," it said. "May I say something?" It was Rick. He stepped forward slowly, his pilot's cap in hand. People quieted. Rick cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was low and gravelly, but steady. "I've flown for 40 years, he began. "I've seen things most people wouldn't believe. I always thought I had a good read on people." He looked at Elijah. "But I was wrong." The silence was thick. "This man," Rick said, "showed more grace and skill in 5 minutes than most do in a lifetime, and I judged him by his title, not by his character." He turned to Elijah directly. "I owe you an apology," he said, "and a thank you." Elijah blinked, stunned. Their eyes met, and in Rick's for the first time there was no sarcasm, just respect, maybe even admiration. The crowd clapped again, but this time it wasn't just for the janitor, it was for the man and the truth that in airports, as in life, you never know who someone truly is until the moment it matters most. Rick didn't leave right after the ceremony. He stayed by the windows, staring out at the runway like he was waiting for something, or maybe running from something else. The hat in his hands, once worn with pride, now felt heavier than usual. Passengers had returned to their routines. Elijah was back at work, accepting congratulations with grace, but never lingering too long. He didn't gloat, didn't bask. That, more than anything, gnawed at Rick. A janitor with aviation knowledge, a man who should have been a pilot. And yet, he kept showing up at dawn to sweep gum wrappers and clean coffee spills. Rick had to ask himself, why? The question sat with him like an old injury that flared in the cold. He found Elijah near Gate 14, polishing a steel handrail. No audience this time, no cameras, just the hum of vending machines and the far-off beep of a baggage truck reversing. Rick approached slowly. Elijah looked up, offered a nod, then went back to work. No tension, no sarcasm, just peace. That unsettled Rick even more. "I was thinking," Rick said quietly, "about what you said, about how you treat people." Elijah paused, then straightened. "I meant no disrespect, sir." "No," Rick said, "but you taught me some, the hard way." He exhaled through his nose, almost chuckling. "You know, when I flew, they gave me medals, pins, clapped when I landed, but I don't think I've ever seen the kind of respect you earned the other day." Elijah said nothing. Rick rubbed his hand over his face. "Truth is, I saw a younger version of me in you, back when I was trying to prove something, back when I thought being somebody meant wearing stripes." He looked at Elijah with an expression that wasn't pride or shame, just truth. "And maybe I got bitter when I realized the world had moved on without me." Elijah nodded slowly. "It's easy to confuse pride with purpose." Rick chuckled. "You sound like my wife." There was a pause. Then Rick's tone shifted. "Why didn't you ever become a pilot?" Elijah hesitated, then looked out the window. "My father died in a maintenance accident here, right over there near Hangar 3. I got into aviation school a week before, but life changed. I had to stay. Help my mom." "Bills don't care about dreams." Rick blinked. "Your father worked here?" "For 22 years, Elijah said softly. "He used to fix the planes you flew." That hit Rick harder than he expected. He looked toward Hangar 3, a quiet part of the airport now, mostly used for storage. He remembered a mechanic named Darryl, strong hands, quiet voice, a good man. "You're Darryl Nash's boy," Rick whispered. Elijah nodded. Rick's eyes glistened. "Darryl saved my hide once in '96, found a stress fracture in a wing panel no one else caught. If he hadn't spoken up, that plane would have gone down over Indiana." He swallowed hard. "I never thanked him properly." Elijah looked at him. "Then maybe today you just did." There was a long silence between them, not awkward, just full. Rick extended his hand. This time Elijah didn't hesitate. They shook, pilot to janitor, man to man, past to present. And for the first time in a long while, Rick felt like he'd landed somewhere important, not on a runway, but in truth. The next morning was quiet. Too quiet for a Saturday, Elijah thought, as he clocked in and headed toward his usual route. The sun was still low, casting long golden rays through the high windows. A few early travelers sipped coffee. The air smelled of cinnamon buns and jet fuel. Near Gate 16, someone was waiting. Rick Thornton sat on a bench with a folder on his lap and a cup of black coffee beside him. He wasn't in uniform today, just jeans, a jacket, and that same old pilot's watch ticking steadily on his wrist. Elijah slowed as he approached. Rick looked up. "Got a minute?" Elijah nodded. "Sure." Rick stood. "I've been thinking about second chances." He held out the folder. Elijah hesitated, then took it. Inside were documents, flight school applications, letters of recommendation, even one written by Rick himself. "I made some calls," Rick said, scratching the back of his neck. "I still know a few people at the regional training programs. Told them about the incident, told them about you." Elijah blinked, caught off guard. "They want to meet you," Rick continued, "not as a janitor, as a candidate." Elijah opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Rick filled the silence. "I know it's not easy. I know life gets in the way, but I also know talent when I see it, and heart. You've got both. You deserve the sky, Elijah." The younger man finally found his voice. "Why are you doing this?" Rick's eyes softened. Because I spent too long guarding my own legacy. Maybe now I can help someone else build theirs. Elijah sat beside him, staring at the folder. It's been years since I touched a simulator, he said quietly. Rick smirked. Muscle memory never dies. Besides, you already helped land a plane in a storm. I think you'll be fine. They sat in silence for a moment, watching a plane taxi slowly down the runway. Rick leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. You know, I used to think respect was earned by how many hours you flew, how many people clapped when you landed. He looked over at Elijah. But now I think real respect is earned when nobody's watching. Elijah smiled, not wide, just enough. Rick reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn pin, his old captain's wings. These don't mean much anymore, he said, placing them in Elijah's palm. But I'd be honored if you kept them, at least until you earn your own. Elijah closed his fingers around the pin. It was heavier than he expected. Thank you, he said, voice full. Rick stood. Whatever you decide, school, no school, just don't let the world convince you you're only what your uniform says you are. As Rick walked away, Elijah remained seated, holding those wings, holding possibility, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel stuck to the ground. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he was already in flight. 6 months later, the terminal looked the same. Same cold tile floors, same murmuring announcements, same distant sound of suitcase wheels rolling over seams. But for Elijah Nash, everything had changed. He stood near gate 14, not with a mop this time, but in a crisp navy blue uniform. A thin silver stripe graced each shoulder, and on his chest gleamed a new pair of wings, not inherited, but earned. Behind him, a small group of employees gathered. A few janitors, a couple of flight attendants, even Jody from supervision. They'd come to watch him board his first official training flight as a co-pilot. Rick Thornton wasn't in the crowd, but he was there, in spirit, and in the envelope Elijah still carried in his bag. Inside were the handwritten notes Rick had sent him after every simulator session, each marked with advice, encouragement, and the occasional sarcastic comment. You flared too early, and again, one had said. But beneath it, proud of you, kid. Rick had passed away 2 weeks earlier, quietly in his sleep, with a photograph of a Boeing 747 on his nightstand and Elijah's flight school graduation photo tucked beneath it. Elijah had spoken at his memorial. A man of the skies, and eventually of humility, he'd said. He taught me that no altitude can compare to the height of character. Now, Elijah took a deep breath as he prepared to board. The air smelled the same: jet fuel, espresso, and someone's too strong cologne. But it felt different, lighter. From across the terminal, a young boy watched him through the glass, eyes wide, face pressed to the window. Elijah smiled and gave a small wave. The boy beamed. That was when Elijah knew he wasn't just flying for himself. He was flying for the janitors, for the mechanics, for his father, for the ones who never made it off the ground, but kept others in the sky. The boarding call rang out. Flight 722 to Atlanta, now boarding crew and first officers. Audrey, Elijah took one last look at the floor he used to clean, and then, with steady steps and a full heart, he walked past it, onto the jet bridge, and into the next chapter, not to leave the past behind, but to rise above it, with grace. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated, or helped someone who was? Click like if Elijah's journey inspired you, and subscribe to join us for more powerful airport stories. And if you want to support more stories like this, consider clicking the Super Thanks button. It helps keep the stories flying. Watch the next emotional tale now. It's waiting for you right on the screen.